Hello everyone. Good morning and good evening, subject to the place from which you are logging. My name is Arvind Pandey. I am faculty at School of Public Policy and Governance, Tata Institute of Social Science, Hyderabad, India. On behalf of our school, I welcome you all in our 60-second perspective lecture. We are organizing a series of webinars as part of our perspective lecture series under a broader theme, which is after COVID, imagining new socio-economic orders. And to deliver the lecture on world economy after COVID-19, we have invited a world-renowned economist, Professor Dani Rodrik. Before introducing to our speaker, I would like to inform you that unfortunately, our respondent, Professor K.P. Kannan, had a minor injury yesterday, so he will not be able to join us. Now, briefly, I would like to introduce about our speaker. Professor Dani Rodrik is Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He has published widely in the area of economic development, international economics, and political economy. His current research focuses on employment and economic growth in both developing and advanced economies. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the inaugural Alberto Hirschman Prize of the Social Sciences Research Council. Professor Rodrik is currently President-elect of the International Economic Association and co-director of the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity Network. His newest book is Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy. As we all are aware that the outbreak of pandemic COVID-19 all over the world has disturbed the political, social, economic, and financial structure of the entire world. And world's topmost economies such as US, China, UK, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and many others are facing severe crisis. It is a belief by most of the scholars, and they are predicting that the condition could be worse and in near future. Then a major question arises that what would be the shape of world economy after COVID-19? Is it possible that the topmost economies will return to the business as usual, or there will be a major restructuring in most of the economies? To answer the questions like these and many more, now I would like to invite Professor Rodrik.
Thank you, Arvind. Thank you, Asim Prakash, for the invitation. I guess one of the upsides of a crisis like this is that actually that we're using the internet and Zoom much more for lectures, and we're able to reach out across countries and give talks virtually. Whereas we were not doing much of that previously, so it makes it easier for me to be with you. So it's nice to be there. As Arvind said, this is a very, very deep crisis, and the question that I want to address is whether after the crisis we are going to be moving to a completely different world. My main argument is going to be that it is going to be a different world, but less perhaps because of what COVID-19 does or the immediate consequences of the crisis per se, but much more because what the crisis does is to reinforce and entrench pre-existing trends. In other words, what the crisis does is to fasten or to speed up the transition to a different kind of a world economy, which already was in transformation before the crisis. So I'm going to be sharing my slides. I hope you can see them. So I plan to speak for maybe 30, 35 minutes, and then we can open it up for questions and comments. There are three trends that I want to highlight at the outset, which I think are the crisis reinforces. The first one of them is within nations, that there is a general movement away or rebalancing that's going on between markets and states. And we're coming out of a market fundamentalist or a neoliberal era where the markets could do nothing wrong and the states should get out of the way. I think that is now being reconsidered. There's a movement from markets to states, and obviously the crisis reinforces that in a very important way by highlighting the importance of states to provide security and social protection to the population, and the inability of markets to solve what are essentially collective action or coordination problems, which is responding to a pandemic. That's what it is. There's a parallel second trend in the world economy at large, which is a movement away from what I've called hyperglobalization back to nation states. I'll come back later to what I mean by hyperglobalization, but the principles of a global economy where we're emphasizing continuous integration of markets and goods, services, and capital. I think it might look like what we're experiencing today is a rupture, but these trends were already in place, and I think the crisis only reinforces those. And third, and perhaps most importantly from the perspective of developing countries, I think we're moving away from a kind of a traditional growth model which emphasizes exports and industrialization to a much more, I would say, domestically oriented growth models. It's not entirely clear what that model is. I'll talk at the end about my presentation about that. Of course, this trend is not a stranger to India, because India never really had an export-oriented industrialization model, which raises the question of, where did the high growth of the last 2.5, 3 decades come from? And I'll address that a little bit at the end of my talk. But this is an ongoing thing, that export orientation and industrialization were no longer as key a driver for growth in most of the the recent high growth countries after the Chinese and East Asian, Southeast Asian growth miracles. And so there's a kind of rebalancing in growth models that's going on that I want to talk about. I think there's a common root, there's a common phenomenon that drives all of these trends. I don't know who's drawing on my screen here. It's not me. Do you see that? And that common root is what I would like to call a process of deepening economic dualism within nations. Now, dualism is something that developing countries are familiar with, but it's actually now taking root within the advanced countries as well. And what I mean by this dualism is that there is a very stark divide within nations, and that's always been true in developing countries, but now it's increasingly true in the advanced nations as well. There's a stark divide that has developed between the technologically advanced, very productive, and globally integrated parts of an economy and a society, and the lagging firms, sectors, and regions in those economies. And I think this fundamental dualism is driving all of these trends. It's driving growing economic inequality and economic insecurity within countries, which is one of the fundamental reasons why we have this rebalancing between markets and states within nations. It's driving the backlash against hyperglobalism, since the left behind sectors of the economy and segments of the population are essentially reacting to the uneven results of hyperglobalization. And third, the fact that the global integrated parts of economies remain rather shallow, and they're not integrating much more deeply and getting more connected with the rest of the economy, also means that the existing models of globalization linked growth or export-oriented industrialization is not working as well as it used to be. This is a phenomenon that I've called premature deindustrialization, that the industrial part of the economy remains small and shallow and is under pressure. And so the traditional export-oriented industrialization engine as a result is not working as well, necessitating the need for these alternative models that I've talked about. So at its bottom, all these trends I think are driven by this one phenomenon, that the kinds of economic, technological choices that we've made, and I emphasize that these were choices, that these economic and technological choices have created highly segmented societies, which are in turn have developed these syndromes of inequality, insecurity, growing gaps within nations, backlash to hyperglobalization, and inability to generate high growth in these world economy linked nations, because the links remain rather shallow and productively ineffective. So that's sort of the big picture. I want to sort of open this up a little bit. I want to say a little bit about the problem within the advanced societies. I want to say a little bit about the problem of hyperglobalism, and then a little bit about the problem of growth in developing nations. And I think I'm not going to be emphasizing a lot about remedies. We can talk about this, but this is really where I think we are in the early stages of thinking. But I think understanding, diagnosing the points, diagnosing the problems accurately is the first step for developing appropriate remedies. One way of looking at what's happening to the developed markets is through the lens of the labor market. And what those trends in the labor market are showing is essentially a collapse of the center. So this is really much less of a problem necessarily of poverty or low incomes, but it's much more that the forces that used to create a robust, prosperous middle class have tended to diminish or disappear. So if we divide up the labor markets of developed countries into three segments, bottom, middle, and top, and we do this division on the basis of either the skills or the wages that workers earn. So putting those with low skills or learning in the bottom category, those with middle skills and medium earnings in the bottom, and the higher skills and highest earnings in the top. And what we look across the advanced countries, what we see that very interesting phenomenon is that it's the middle of the labor markets that has been collapsing in terms of employment and in terms of wages. In other words, these are the, if you want to think concretely, these are the production workers that have been decimated because of the China trade shock or other phenomena linked to globalization or technological change, or the sales and clerical workers in service industries that perhaps have been less affected by globalization, but much more by automation and new digital technologies. But it's the middle, and that's created, I think, a much weaker middle class and much greater precarity and economic insecurity in the middle of the advanced, of the labor markets of the advanced countries. And that seems to be a kind of a fairly universal phenomenon. There's a linked trend that is happening, which is closely associated with this phenomenon of dualization, which is that if you look at firms that are doing very well versus firms in the same sectors that are lagging behind, the gap in terms of productivity performance is becoming wider and wider. In other words, the winners are doing very well, while those who are not in the winning group, the lagging firms, are doing increasingly more poorly. This is true both of manufacturing and for services. So there is a growing divide, and this is fundamentally what I meant by this is the productive dualism that I mentioned already, that there is this growing gap between the winners and those who are not doing well. So you look at it from the perspective of the advanced countries, there's this phenomenon that when you put these two things together, that the problems of inclusion and low growth in some sense have become one and the same, because part of the problem of low growth is that high productivity, innovation, new technologies are not disseminating sufficiently rapidly from the frontier firms to the rest of the economy. And that's both means that overall productivity growth in the advanced countries is staying low, despite the seeming surfeit of new technologies and AI and everything else. At the same time, it means that the workers who are not part of the frontier firms are suffering sort of a stagnation or much greater economic insecurity. And that's part of what's happening to the middle of the labor force that I've showed you. So one way of sort of putting all of this in my recent work, I've talked about sort of the problem of good jobs and asking what the good jobs are going to be coming from. This is in some ways a phenomenon that of advanced countries becoming more like developing countries. So I find it somewhat odd that I'm now talking more and more about advanced nations, even though most of my research has been on developing countries. But I find that my research on developing countries now helps me understand what's going on in the advanced countries much better than before, because this dualization of labor market, the absence of good jobs, is increasingly a phenomenon of the advanced nations as well. Of course, deep down, these trends are the result of technology and globalization, but those things are not necessarily completely exogenous phenomena. These are things that actually we partly control. How, you might ask? Well, I think the right way to think about it, and I'm going to be very, very short here because this is the beginning of a very extended discussion, is to think about sort of the employment and innovation decisions that firms undertake as essentially being subject to a fundamental externality. And let's call this good job externalities, because when firms make their employment and innovation decisions, they do not necessarily take into account or internalize the consequences of not generating sufficient numbers of good jobs. What are those consequences? We now have quite extensive work in the context of advanced countries that shows that the absence of good jobs can have serious effects on social and political life through broken families, drug abuse, crime, to political polarization and support for right-wing populist parties, to the rise of authoritarian values. And so viewed from this perspective, then the question becomes, how does public policy address this externality? And once we frame it as an externality, then I think we open up a kind of a wide range of possible remedies to target these externalities. We think we need to work both on policies that would increase the supply of good jobs, working with existing firms, working with labor force in terms of with workforce development policies, and also increasingly making sure that our innovation systems, our technological development systems are able to redirect innovation in a more labor-friendly direction. In some sense, I think what this calls for, and I'm still in the context of advanced nations, although I would argue that when I come back to talk about growth in the developing nations, that some aspects of this are also going to be very relevant to developing nations. But that what this calls for is a kind of a new type of industrial policy, which differs from the traditional East Asian style of industrial policy, which is this top-down regulatory model of just providing incentives or subsidies to selected firms or industries, but much more a kind of a collaborative, iterative model of a strategic cooperation between the state and various developmental agencies, and both civil society organizations and private firms, targeting the generation of the increase and expansion of employment opportunities, improving labor standards, and making firms aware of the employment consequences of the technologies they adopt and how they deploy them on the labor force. So this is more kind of a process of getting firms to internalize these incentives by recognizing the range of technological opportunities that might be available, and understanding that ultimately their prosperity also relies on an ecosystem of healthy labor markets and productive suppliers and cohesive social contexts. I've written about this in a recent paper with Chuck Sable. I'm not going to say more about that. In case you're interested, you can look it up. Let me turn now to the hyper globalization and the retreat from hyper globalization. First, I want to make clear here that that globalization doesn't come in just one particular form. What I call hyperglobalization, I think, was a particular type of a globalization model, which began to take root in the 1990s. I think in trade, it was the creation of the World Trade Organization. In finance, it was financial globalization, the free flow of short-term capital becoming the norm rather than the exception that marked this transition. And I think the way to distinguish hyperglobalization is by focusing on sort of the difference between the earlier Bretton Woods regime and what came after the 1990s. So the traditional model of trade liberalization under the GATT, the traditional sort of GATT IMF Bretton Woods rules, was that that liberalization was rather unambitious, remained limited on import. The early model of globalization in the first few decades after the Second World War was a kind of what I've called it, or what has been called, a shallow model of integration, which was that on trade was a rather limited model of just reducing restrictions at the border. Of course, capital flows were managed as a rule, and this really provided much greater space for each country to develop and pursue its own developmental model. The hyperglobalization model with the World Trade Organization, the proliferation of regional trade agreements, and financial globalization increasingly sort of became a model where domestic policies and regulations could also be seen as trade restrictions. So therefore, we started to have restrictions on policy facing agriculture and subsidies, intellectual property rights, in health and sanitary conditions, environmental policies. And I think that sort of went along with a kind of a fundamental realignment of who was driving the rules, with international firms and banks, multinational corporations, big pharma, big tech, increasingly becoming essentially new agenda setters for this kind of globalization. And I think in some ways the pre-hyperglobalization era viewed the global economy as a means to an end, which was the global economy was a means through which national economies could achieve their ends. Increasingly, I think after the 1990s, the global economy became the end, and national economic policies and national economy became a means, so that societies had to do this or that to adjust to globalization, rather than using globalization to leverage their own particular economic and social objectives. Of course, the major exception to that rule was paradoxically China, which during the hyperglobalization era applied all the policies of the Bretton Woods, the earlier globalization model, to its own economic policies. So it managed its exchange rate, its capital flows, used subsidies, state-owned enterprises, industrial policies. In other words, used it leveraged the global economy to restructure and to diversify its own economy and achieve significant rates of growth. So the fact that the hyperglobalization was so beneficial to China is not that China was playing by hyperglobalist rules. It was that the rest of the world was playing by hyperglobalist rules, while China was effectively playing by Bretton Woods rules. I think this became unsustainable because of the backlash, the labor market consequences of China trade shock, the increasing resistance in Europe and elsewhere to investment rules and other rules that seem to put the objectives of capital ahead of other social objectives. And I think we are, again, at a point where there is, in terms of globalization, it's not realistic to talk about a return to a kind of status quo ante, because the status quo ante has proved itself to be unstable and unsustainable. So I think it's time to think about what that alternative model of globalization might be. I would emphasize here three principles. I've expanded on this in a few pieces, most recently in a piece in the Prospect magazine in Britain that just came out last week. But I would emphasize sort of three principles that we want to emphasize in a global economic order that tends to produce benefits to all rather than to few. So you do want to go after things that have that produce very large gains from trade, unlike many of the things that in the recent past, like intellectual property rights or investor-state dispute settlement, where the gains are really limited and the impact is much more redistributive. Second, I think the domain for international rules should be fairly restricted to areas where there are demonstrable beggar thy neighbor effects or demonstrable global public goods. There are two areas where global public goods are very important: public health, quite appropriately today, and global climate change. And in fact, a new order of globalization in many ways ought to be built around those challenges, the public health challenge and the climate change challenge, rather than economics, where in fact most economic policies are neither in the nature of beggar thy neighbor nor in the nature of providing global public goods. But otherwise, that I would look for, essentially I would leave countries fairly free to pursue their own national economic arrangements. So I think that would essentially provide a kind of a thinner model of globalization in the sense of how deep the rules went, but I think it would be a much more sustainable globalization. I think that kind of a globalization also has the advantage that it could accommodate and help the framework for resolving the US-China trade war, which I think is probably the most important thing that's breaking down our existing global economic order today. And I don't think the US-China economic relationship can be put on a stable, sustainable course unless there is a kind of understanding on both parts, on both sides, that you need to establish some principles of peaceful economic coexistence between the US and China, whereby the US understands that it's not going to remake China in its own image or in the image of an idealized market economy, that China is a very unorthodox, kind of an economic model, which has served itself very well. And so therefore, it's not US's business or the business of anybody else to tell China how to run their economy. On the other hand, I think China will have to understand that advanced countries, the US and Europe, might have legitimate reasons to protect their labor market, their social systems, their technological and innovation systems from Chinese exports, investment, or rivalry, or stealing, depending on your perspective. So that there are some things that China should not simply, some levels of openness and access which China cannot simply take for granted. That will still, I think, leave room for considerable gains from trade, as long as there's an understanding that there are limits to this previous model of deep integration. Let me just skip on that now, and just in the last bit of my comments, let me turn to growth in the context of developing countries. And I'm conscious now that I'm running a little bit late, so let me try to do this in 5 minutes or so. The developing countries had a very good 2 or 3 decades, and of course, India was one of the countries which was part of this very rapid growth in the last 2 or 3 decades. But that's, as in the case of India, that's been sort of already was coming back down before the crisis. And I think what's going to happen after the crisis is a kind of an environment where I think having sort of pre-crisis growth rates is going to be, or going back to those pre-crisis growth rates is not going to be feasible. Once again, not because of the crisis per se, although that certainly will move in the same direction, but because the pre-crisis growth was unsustainable. And let me explain what I mean by why that growth was unsustainable. I think when we look at sort of rapid growth experiences around the world, there's one thing that stands out, is that except for a few small countries that grew on the back of natural resources and commodity booms, that's industrialization or industrialization-led structural change has been the most reliable engine for rapid growth. This goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, the catch-up in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, then East Asia and China, that industrialization has been the key. And industrialization has been key because I think manufacturing combines 3 features which very few other parts of the economy does. One is this process that's called unconditional convergence, which is that manufacturing productivity tends to converge fairly rapidly to the frontier, regardless of poor institutions or poor policies. So that if you're able to build some modern factories, it's easy to converge to a frontier productivity. Second, manufacturing traditionally has been good labor absorber. It's easy to absorb workers from the countryside into factories. And third, there are no constraints on the demand side, which is that once you build some manufacturing, you can actually export them to the world market. So low incomes or productivity in the rest of the economy don't present a constraint. Now, the problem is that all of these things are not changing, primarily because manufacturing is becoming much more skill intensive, much more technology intensive, and also because earlier winners in manufacturing, China and a number of East Asian to Southeast Asian countries, have already pre-existing global market. That is much harder, it's been much harder for newcomers to actually replicate that kind of exercise, experience. And so there's a very common phenomenon of premature deindustrialization that's happening. Countries are simply not industrializing the same level. And that means that recent growth spurts are actually driven not by manufacturing per se, but factors, in particular demand-driven factors that have been much less sustainable. And I'll come back to that in a second, but let me first talk about sort of this manufacturing. So the manufacturing, tends to, countries tend to industrialize and then deindustrialize. What has been happening is that this process of deindustrialization is happening much more quickly now at much lower levels of income. So this shows basically drawing the relationship between manufacturing employment shares and per capita GDP, comparing what the curve looked like before the 1990s and what looks like after the 1990s. You can see this very rapid decline after the 1990s. So what that means is that this traditional model of structural change, which is that workers would tend to move out of traditional agriculture into sort of organized manufacturing activities and then ultimately to services. Today, what's happening is that the movement out of traditional agriculture is directly into services, and most of them actually informal rather than formal, completely bypassing, for the most part, sort of this process of manufacturing. So it's not that people aren't coming out of the countryside and agriculture. That's happening, but it's workers are getting into services. This is very clear in the experience of. Let me see. I had a chart here that I wanted to show. Yeah. So this is the phenomenon in India. So this just look at the recent experience after 2011. So employment loss is that there's about that 26 million people left agriculture in this period, and all of them were absorbed into non-farm employment. But what kind of non-farm employment? It's, if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, you see trade and hospitality, construction, transport, education, and health. It's all mostly non-traded services. And if you had a formal-informal breakdown, it would also be mostly informal rather than formal. So the question is, and this is more a matter of theory, but in terms of understanding how you get, so how countries like India, and I don't have time to talk about other cases, how to interpret this growth experience, which had a much more different type of a pattern of structural change, not industrialization, but moving into services. I think the way that sort of one framework is developed in a recent, a couple of years ago, I guess, a paper that I wrote with Shinchan Diao and Maggie McMillan, where the framework is a general one, not for India per se, but I think it applies to India as well, or the gross outlines of the Indian experience, which is the story goes like this. So imagine that there is some reason that investment demand goes up. So think about it. In many countries, this was actually public investment booms. But in India, it was, I believe, more of an private investment. So for whatever reason, private investors start to believe the future is brighter. Maybe that's because there's some liberalization going on. Maybe there's the animal spirits of private investors are ignited. So there's a kind of a traditional growth promoting channel from an increased investment demand, because as you increase investment, the labor productivity is going to go up, and then you're going to get the standard conditional convergence, that is the convergence on conditional on the higher investment rate that is going to go on. The problem is that this story cannot explain in full the Indian growth takeoff, because this channel doesn't produce nearly enough growth. The standard conditional convergence tends to be very slow, does not produce nearly enough growth to explain the kind of 8% or more growth that the Indian economy was experiencing. So in fact, there was something else going on. And what that something else is that there's this demand side channel, which is that increased investment demand also makes people, the recipients of the income that is generated by this increased investment spending now have more money to spend. What do they spend on? At the margin, they're spending more on services. And when they spend on services, then that's where you get the increased demand for construction, for hospitality, and other kinds of services that I just showed you. So there is an induced pattern of structural change towards now non-traded services that's happening. So this is what I mean by growth through structural change. And because productivity in these urban services or non-farm services tends to be higher than productivity in traditional agriculture, that's the second and quite significant productivity enhancing part of growth that comes in through this. So you have this phenomenon that the increase in investment demand sets into motion an increased reallocation of labor towards more productive services, and that creates economy-wide productivity growth, which in some sense also validates the private investment expectations early that there was some growth opportunities. But the story doesn't end there, because these services like construction don't have the kind of endogenous productivity growth and endogenous productive dynamism that manufacturing has. Then what you have is that you have increasingly a kind of expansion of services that are relatively low productivity. So when you're looking at productive transformation within these service sectors that are expanding, it's not like they're becoming more productive. If anything, often they're becoming less productive. So that the parts of the economy that are expanding the most rapidly are also the ones that are beginning to lag in productivity. And that's actually what stops the growth and ultimately makes growth unsustainable, or at least that kind of high growth unsustainable. And that, I think, is true regardless of whether the initial boom in investment demand came from the private sector or it comes from the public sector. But ultimately, this growth boom comes to an end. And I think this is the story, it seems to me, in India. It was the story in Ethiopia. It's the story in some Central American countries or Latin American countries that have high growth as well. I'll stop here without getting too much into what the alternatives might be, because I already spoke too much. So let me just end here by going back to my main themes, which is that we need recalibration in these three areas in the post-pandemic world. The relationship between markets and states with respect to generating good jobs in particular, with respect to the relationship between global economy and national economies, and with respect to generating a healthier, more sustainable globalization. And I think in the low and middle income countries, coming up with new growth models that are necessarily going to be less reliant on industrialization and the world economy. So thank you for your indulgence, and let me just stop here. I'll stop sharing also my slide.
For such a fascinating lecture. We have obviously we and our students are mostly benefited from many new things. We have learned that how we have shifted from hyper globalization model, from traditional model of trade liberalization, trade agreement, to the hyper globalization model of development, and then three basic principles for the new kind of globalization which we want, that in that global economic order for all, and the focused global governance where the economic gains are available largely for all. And then you have highlighted three major key points, that the initial phase, the industrial-led structural change has been the most reliable engine for rapid growth. But now this kind of rapid and sustained industrialization is very unlikely in future, and we are heading toward the kind of environment when the recent growth spurts have been demand driven and unsustainable. So there is alternative model of development exists, but these models are not very clear, and there are many shortcomings in these models. So yeah, and how we have shifted from the traditional model of economy where we have first moved from agriculture to the manufacturing and services. Now we are directly jumping from agriculture to the manufacturing and services. So yeah, it's a very thought-provoking